Hello, everyone. Welcome to our workshop. I think people are still coming in, but in the interest of time, I said I would get us going at about 100. We are so excited for the interest in this workshop. My name is Alison Hamilton, and I lead the UCLA Rapid, Rigorous, and Relevant Implementation Science Hub, funded by NIMH as a supplement to CHIPS. We are really thrilled to be doing this workshop today. I couldn't be happier to be doing it with my wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Erin Finley. So I will have her introduce herself in just a moment, but just a tiny bit more about me. In addition to leading this hub, I do implementation research both in the VA and at UCLA. And I'm an anthropologist by training and an implementation scientist, a professor in psychiatry at UCLA. And I think that's probably sufficient for our purposes today. Erin, would you like to do a quick intro?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. I'm very excited about this topic. So I'm Erin Finley. I am also at the VA in Greater Los Angeles and get to work with Alison there, which is wonderful. I'm also associate professor in the departments of medicine and psychiatry at UT Health San Antonio. Trained as a medical anthropologist, spend most of my time in health services research and implementation science, and I really just think semi-structured interview guides are the linchpin of doing really great qualitative work in this area, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about it, so I'm thrilled that we're going to dedicate some time to it today.
Me too. And we were kind of amazed that this type of guidance isn't super explicitly out there. So we hope that this is filling a need for all of you based on the registrations. We think it is. So thank you again for your interest. And I just want to thank Elena Rosenberg Carlson, who is at the center of making the hub happen. And she can definitely answer any questions that you may have in terms of technical support throughout our webinar today. So just a little bit of logistics before we get going. We do have a good amount of content, and so we're going to get through that and then make sure that we have a good amount of time at the end for discussion and questions. So you can post your questions in the chat, or you can hang on to them. Of course, if there's anything that we need to just clarify, if you missed something that we said, or there's some acronym that we forgot to spell out, anything like that, feel free to ask during the course of the webinar. But we want to make sure that we get through everything. I know some people can only be here for an hour. So we want to get through that, and then we'll be really interested to hear what your questions and comments are after we get through the content portion. And we are recording, trying to remember all of our logistics. So we are recording. This will be posted on our YouTube playlist, which is at the end of the slides. So you'll have a link to that. And transcription is on for anyone who may appreciate that during the course of the workshop. Elena, Erin, am I missing anything logistically?
Nope, that's great.
Okay. So I think we're ready to get started. So we decided to break this down into four kind of dimensions of working on interview guides. We really felt like it wouldn't make sense for us to talk about designing interview guides without spending a little bit of time talking about overall design and approaches to organizing your semi-structured data collection. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on rationale and design. Then we'll talk about what we bring to the process of designing interview guides in terms of existing knowledge, the types of constructs that we're often incorporating into our guides, theories, models, and frameworks, which is always a big topic in these workshops. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time on actually formulating the guide and some steps that we'd recommend taking as you develop and use your guide, and we'll provide you some examples as well. And then we'll wrap up by talking about using and refining the guide, iterating the guide as you start to use the guide in the field. These phases are, appear to be sort of sequential, but they are very much interrelated. And so just bear that in mind as we talk, that you're going to often come back to existing knowledge, you're going to come back to design, you're going to come back to your research questions. So it looks like a list, but it's a list that's very, very interrelated in how this actually happens as we're using this form of data collection. So we'll start with some design considerations because these have a lot to do with how you set up your interview guide or guides. And we'll talk later about the potential for needing more than one guide in your project, depending on your sampling approach. So that's another piece of what we'll cover in the first segment of the workshop. So, of course, we don't have time to get into multiple designs, and there are many wonderful papers that can help you with designs. I think one of the key points that we want to just bring up here is thinking about your design in relation to how you're going to use your qualitative data. And that's going to have a lot to do with how you design your interview guides. So just really briefly, of course, what we're doing in implementation research is evaluation using qualitative methods. There is, different terminology out there for what the types of evaluation are called. So recognizing that, we can think broadly about process evaluation and formative evaluation, where traditionally process evaluation is done in maybe effectiveness studies or hybrid type 1 studies. And we're not looking in those types of designs to use the data we're collecting to influence what's happening during the study. So we're not trying to change what's happening, we're observing it. We might do some pre-post data collection, but we're not necessarily, doing anything kind of proactively with that data. So that's going to be different than studies that are designed to actually use data that's collected during the course of implementation in order to inform what's happening. So that's more characteristic of formative evaluation. That has a lot of implications, not only for what you ask people, but how you process the data to make sure that it is feeding back in a timely way to what's happening during the course of implementation. And this type of evaluation would be more typical of your hybrid types 2 and 3 designs, where you might be making adjustments to the implementation strategy, to the intervention. You might be learning things that are really key for your implementation teams to know. And so when you're collecting qualitative data for those purposes, it's going to have a much different kind of flavor and feel than it is in studies where you're not necessarily using that data in real time. Erin, anything else you want to mention there?
No, just I think that was wonderful. Just thinking that, and in some studies, it's been known that maybe you start out with some formative evaluation and then you shift more to a process focused. We have one study where we have 3 waves, and in the first wave, we really treated it as formative. And then in waves 2 and 3, we moved much more into a process evaluation so we could get a little cleaner sense of what was happening. So always there's some fluidity, but I think these are really important as a starting place. It's like, what is the function of this data going to be?
Yeah, that's going to be one of our key themes. What Erin just said, what is the function of this data? What are you using it for? What do you need it for? How does it fit into your overall project goals? So that's going to be a key take home for you all as you think about how you're going to use this type of data. How does it align with your project goals and hopefully help you accomplish those goals? So there are a couple of, depending on whose definitions you're looking at, there are a couple of different ways of thinking about formative evaluation in studies where you're potentially using your qualitative and or mixed methods data to inform what's happening during implementation. So this might include looking at those discrepancies that pretty much inevitably happen between what you plan to do and what actually happens during the course of implementation. Adaptations are often happening during the course of implementation. We want to have ways to capture those. We want to be able to identify barriers and what it takes to overcome those barriers if possible. Maybe there are, new components that need to be added to an intervention or refinements made to your original implementation strategy. And qualitative methods are, I would say, extremely well suited to address these phenomena, if not best suited to address these phenomena. All of these points, which are not exhaustive by any means, but all of these points are pretty difficult to measure because they're very specific, quantitatively, I mean, because they're very specific to what's happening on the ground in local settings. And so our measures aren't necessarily best at capturing those local variations and actual processes that are going on in our implementation settings. So this is where qualitative methods have just been indispensable in implementation research. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't necessarily use quantitative measures as well, but for items like these, phenomena like these, your qualitative methods are going to be very, very strong go-to sources for information. With summative evaluation, which is typically done at the end, where we're really trying to understand the impacts of the implementation processes, how was care changed, affected, et cetera. We might be looking at the economic impact of implementation strategies. So we often see quantitative methods being used for summative evaluation, certainly qualitative as well. But when we're looking at measuring impacts, that's often where we're turning more to integrated mixed methods in our summative evaluations. Anything else you want to mention there, Erin?
No, I think that's great. And I think this really just gets back to, qualitative methods are so strong for helping us understand kind of what's actually happening, what we could not have predicted. Many times the quantitative measures are so helpful for capturing kind of the predictable outcomes, but qualitative can really help to fill in all those pieces that we couldn't have predicted, so we didn't plan to measure. And that's really valuable and helpful. No, that's all I'd add.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about choosing your qualitative methods. Of course, our focus today is on semi-structured interviews, which, as Erin mentioned, are really the bread and butter, historically speaking, of implementation research. I think we're seeing, expansions of qualitative methods, which is absolutely wonderful and fantastic to see the evolution in our methods toolkits and implementation research over the past couple of decades. But we're not by any means suggesting in this workshop that semi-structured interviews would be the only qualitative method that you would use, but we want to provide guidance for that particular approach. Really, semi-structured individual interviews is our focus, although you'd also be using a semi-structured interview guide for focus groups. So we're not going to get into other methods today, but rather just to make the point that we want to really choose methods that are well suited for our research questions and consider some other aspects of that process of methods decision making in terms of, for example, feasibility. That's going to be key to making data collection happen. What is it possible to do? What is your team capable of doing? What expertise do you need? One thing that we really think about a lot in designing these types of projects is how much data is needed. We tend to collect more than we need and then more than we do anything with. And of course, we don't know how much data we need exactly, but we want to, again, make our work feasible, make sure it can be done, make sure that it's helping with our project goals. And so that might mean that we're sort of putting some parameters around how much data we're collecting. It might not be everything that you'd ever want to collect and everything that you'd ever imagine would be important to collect, but we do need to make decisions so that the work can get done and that everyone on the team understands what the priorities are. That's another key theme of our workshop today, is really prioritizing what you're hoping to achieve with your semi-structured qualitative methods. Other issues that we think about and that will come up throughout the course of the workshop include potential integration of your qualitative data with quantitative data. We won't get into a lot about mixed methods, but certainly touch on things that we have observed and learned to be really helpful in integrated mixed methods about implementation evaluations. We want to think very carefully in designing these projects about when interviews will be conducted, not only looking at the timing, but what is the rationale for that timing. So going back to the design issues, are you doing pre, mid, and post interviews, but you have a hybrid type 1, you won't necessarily use the midpoint implementation interviews, and they have the potential to alter the course of the study. So you want to think, well, maybe we shouldn't do interviews in the middle of implementation in this hybrid type 1, maybe pre-post, something like that. So really thinking about your design in relation to the timing of your data collection and the rationale for that is going to be key, and again will affect your interview guides. As Erin mentioned, we really want to think about when and how the data will be used. What is the purpose of it? How is it going to inform what's happening with the study? And you may have different plans at different times and junctures for the overall project. And another key point that we will probably make several times is thinking early and often about analysis. So how is analysis going to happen? When is analysis going to happen? What's the approach for analysis? Again, thinking, if you're collecting data midstream or perhaps throughout the course of the implementation project, there might be work that needs to be done with your analytic team to be able to inform processes, again, depending on your design. So Erin, do you want to walk us through the next few slides, just thinking about kind of timing, organizing data, thinking through some of these issues with a couple of visuals?
Yeah, sure. And we don't have to spend a lot of time on them, but in the design phase, and all of this is going to lead up to the guide, but it's really also interconnected, and it all has to, I think the connections between the design and the guide and the analysis all have to be really carefully thought out to be as successful as we want them to be. We often map things in a few different ways when we're designing, because it can be so helpful in thinking about, okay, this is going to inform this, we're going to be able to put these data sources together. So this is just an example of when we were building the Empower query, the first iteration, we're on Empower 2 now, how we were thinking about putting together the different methods we were using and how the timing came together. So we knew we were going to be we were using replicating effective programs, REP as the implementation strategy. So the phases are according to REP. But we knew we were going to be talking to providers in the preconditions phase, and that was going to be helping to inform our tailoring of the intervention. Then we were going to talk to them again pre-implementation, and that was going to be informing how we did the implementation itself. We were going to talk to them again at the maintenance point, so we could start to think about how do we support sustainment. So each of those time points, we had a different function for the interview. We also had surveys happening at the same time. We were talking to patients before implementation and after implementation. And that was really about understanding how patient experiences might have changed based on changes happening in the clinic at the time that we were doing the work. We also integrated some more ethnographic kinds of data for reflections so that we were able to look at some of the things happening through the course of implementation without, as Alison made the point, of introducing that potential little wiggle on implementation that can happen if you start talking with providers partway through. There's ways to get around that, but these were the sorts of things we were thinking about. And then we were thinking about how do we put this together with quantitative data over time, and how are these time points all going to come together when we do the analysis. So mapping it this way can be kind of a useful exercise for just thinking about when is the data going to be coming in, and what is that going to allow you to do, and is it actually going to be answering the questions that you're needing to and intending to answer. Next slide.
And I just want to mention that if you're curious about reflections, we have a workshop on that. So in our YouTube playlist, which is at the end of the slides, is a whole list of all the workshops we've done And Erin and I did a reflections workshop over the summer. So if you want more on that method, you have a resource for that.
This is another way that we sort of map these pieces out. Again, in my preference, I like to do this before I start writing the grant. It will change, but I find it facilitates the writing so much if you've got it kind of mapped out exactly what the pieces are going to be. So we like to put together a data summary where you've got your study aims, your key study questions, if those are different from your aims, and then you're mapping out sort of each data source, who's going to be involved, what is the content of that data source going to be. So if it's interviews, maybe it's acceptability, maybe it's compatibility, maybe it's how much people want this intervention you're trying to bring in, being mindful of the timing, thinking ahead of time about, okay, how are we going to analyze these data? Maybe we're going to do a rapid qualitative analysis first, and then we're going to go back and do some more targeted coding later for X, Y, or Z, and just really nailing that back to what exactly in our aims or our questions is this data source intended to help us address. Laying it out like this can be really helpful in just making all of those pieces come together in a very explicit way. Is there more you would say about that, Alison?
Just to highlight that this can be a combination of your methods. So it's there, but I just want to make sure that it's really clear that when you put a table like this together across your different sources, you're helping to orient toward your integrated mixed methods if you're using mixed methods. So something like this, where you have this ability to look across all of your different sources and which sources are covering the same variables, which ones are covering different variables. I feel like it's something that we go back to all the time throughout the course of projects, especially as you're working toward mixed methods analyses. You can go back to this and see, wait, what do we have? Do we have items on leadership in both our survey and our interviews? What question does that relate to, et cetera? When did we collect that data? So I feel like this is going to be something that will help you all, even very much in the beginning. And something like this could be extremely powerful for a proposal, for example, but it's going to carry you throughout the life of the project.
It really is. I mean, it's so silly, but it's so easy, particularly when you're doing these really intensive implementation projects or you're collecting a lot of data. And at a certain point, you look up and you go, wait, what are we doing? And having this to go back to and just be like, okay, this is what we need to accomplish with this is so helpful. Okay.
Yeah. Something like this, do yourself a favor and create something like this.
And this is just an example from an AHRQ funded project we've been doing at UT Health around patient-reported outcomes in orthopedic practices. So talking with providers at 2 different time points and just being clear about what is going to be the content of those 2 separate interviews and why do we need both and when are those happening and how are we going to put those together. Also understanding the patient interviews as well. And then as Alison was making the point, these are mixed method data. So this is also going to have a row for our clinic chart data and which specific variables are we going to be pulling from that chart data, when is that going to be happening, and how are we intending to put those together. So this also can be helpful, as mentioned in the grant, if you want to include it, because it's a good way of showing folks that you have thought through your mixed method integration from the beginning, and that helps to make the case for you. So just an example of that.
Very powerful example, and also includes the sample sizes. So you've got that at a glance. You've got your analytic approaches, at least initial analytic approaches detailed. So this is telling us a lot in a relatively small space. And it really will serve as this great foundation for moving forward with these plans. I don't think either of us could emphasize enough how helpful tables like this are. You'll see a lot of tables throughout the workshop because they are so supportive of keeping things organized and oriented and helping the team see what's happening when, where, with whom, and why. I do see questions coming in. Thanks, Elena, for getting them organized for us. I really look forward to hearing what you all are thinking and wondering about. So we will get to them, I promise. Okay, so one more piece of backdrop before we get to designing the guide. This is very much in line with designing the guide, which is that we are coming to these projects with a lot of existing knowledge. It might not be our own knowledge, might be other people's knowledge, but we're coming to the design of our guides with knowledge that will inform the semi-structured nature of these interview guides. So we're not starting from zero. We're not starting from a blank slate. It's pretty rare that we could, I don't even know if we could get funded to start with such a blank slate. And you know, really it's a bit of a misnomer that we could even have a blank slate, because we are, you know, constantly building our knowledge and learning from many, many sources. So of course, we are organizing our implementation evaluations using theories, models, and frameworks. There is also a workshop about that in our YouTube playlist if you want to know more about theories, models, and frameworks that Russ Glasgow and I did a little while ago. But that's really central to how we organize these projects, is selecting theories, models, frameworks that meet our project goals and that give us constructs to work with. So what we don't have time to do today is, and I don't know that there ever would be enough time, because there are like hundreds of these to choose from. So we're not, you know, going to organize this according to here's how you would design a guide for X, Y, and Z framework. That's just a bit beyond what we can do. And really, we want to deal with some more general points about the application of theories, models, and frameworks in your qualitative data collection. But that being said, it is key to have possibly more than one of these. You might have a framework and a theory. You may be combining a couple of different frameworks. So we'll come back to some of that, but suffice to say that this is going to be a key element of the design of your interview guide, which might be different than how you would design a guide in another project that didn't have theories, models, and frameworks quite so central to the mission. We also are starting with existing knowledge to some extent of you know, people's existing perspectives on what we're studying. And that can come from many different vantage points and many different types of experience. It might be clinical experience. It might be people's day-to-day lived experience. It might be our policy partners' experiences of incorporating this work into policy and practice. We bring subject matter experts in. So we have a lot of knowledge coming from a lot of different directions as we design the guides, and that is to our benefit, that they're as rich and full of that existing knowledge as they can possibly be. Of course, also drawing on previous studies that have been conducted, even if they were not your own, chances are they weren't, and drawing on literature, reports, anything you can find out there that will help you to ground your guide in as much existing knowledge as possible, while still leaving room for new knowledge and new discoveries and new information. So we're with semi-structured, it's not structured. So we still want to have that openness and that spirit of inquiry as we design our guides. But we want to put knowledge into them as well. And we do so pretty explicitly. Anything you want to add there, Erin?
No, I think that's beautiful. I think that piece about balancing, you know, we want to come with the best we know about something, but we also want to always make sure that we're keeping it open, there is an exploratory element in any semi-structured work, and that's really valuable and important. But striking that right balance can be a little tricky, which is why we'll talk about the formulating piece.
Right. We wanted to do a quick frequently asked question here because it does come up a lot in our experience of doing trainings, which is this question of, if I have a theory, model, or framework, which of course you will in implementation science, do I have to use every construct? And the very simple answer to that is no, you don't. And it might not be relevant or feasible to use every construct, might not be appropriate to use every construct. So you want to include the ones that are the most relevant and high priority for your project. And if you aren't exploring all of the constructs in a given framework, you also want to have a rationale for why you're not. So if you're proposing, for example, to use, let's say, REAIM PRISM, but you're at a fairly early stage of your study, where you might not be ready to look at something like maintenance, maybe just explore the potential for maintenance. That might not be a core construct that you're digging into in your data collection, although it might be part of some exploratory work toward the end of the project. So you can certainly leave out constructs or not put as much emphasis on them, but you want to explain why, so that you're reflecting that you know that they are in the framework, but you're just not necessarily covering them within the parameters of your particular project. And we really want to have questions related to our constructs that are going to make sense for people when they're actually asked the question, and that help them to describe what matters the most to them. So what's going to get in the way of making, such and such practice or intervention part of routine care? We want the questions to still be open and exploratory and inquisitive. They do map back to the constructs of interest, but we're trying to understand how people are making sense of things with these questions. Anything you want to add, Erin?
I would just maybe quickly say, when it comes to something, so we always talk about CFR, and CFR is great, and the updated CFR is out there. We haven't cited it here, but it's there. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, and it's great. But for things like this, one of the challenges, if you're dealing with particularly a theory that's got a lot of constructs, is how do you prioritize what's most important? And I do think it's worth underscoring the point that we want to invite people to tell us what's most important. We can always use those constructs to go in and code, to go in and summarize, to say, okay, they told us this, and now we can look at the theory and help to make sense of what they told us. But they can really be our participants can be very powerful in telling us where we need to be focusing most. That's all.
Absolutely. Okay, so what we wanted to just bring up here were some common constructs that we often address in semi-structured interview guides in implementation evaluations. So again, your model, the theory model or framework that you select, is going to help you to identify the domains or constructs that are of most importance to your study, which is why you chose that framework or model in the first place. But broadly speaking, without getting too into the weeds of any particular model or framework, we're often asking questions about the practice or the intervention that we're looking to stand up or potentially de-implement. Things like, what do people think about the evidence for this particular intervention, the complexity of it, the adaptability of it, the relative advantage, the cost. We ask questions related to context, such as culture and climate questions related to readiness for change, tension for change. We're often asking about leadership and resources, structures and infrastructures. And we're asking about people. So what do people think? What do they know? What do they believe? What do they do? Of course, we're asking people about what they do, and that might be nicely complemented by observing what they do, putting a little pitch out there for some observation, because there might be a gap between what people say they do and what they actually do. We want to know about relationships, about self-efficacy, readiness, motivation, commitment to the organizational mission. We know is strongly tied to implementation, burnout. And these might sound familiar for folks who are doing work in organizational readiness for change. Many of these constructs you'll see in the measures related to readiness at an organizational level. And these are, again, just some examples of constructs that we are often dealing with in one way or another, and that cut across a lot of models and frameworks that are out there. So we really wanted to focus on the more general, what types of topics are we addressing? And then, of course, in the process of designing your guide, these will be tied very closely to that model or framework that you've selected. But these are some things that we pretty much always want to know in implementation, and that are going to really help us understand where people are starting from and what happens over the course of time in an implementation project. Anything more about the constructs, Erin?
Very quickly, one thing I think it's really critical to try and get at when we can is sort of how much do people want something? And that can kind of go into motivation, but it can bleed into some of the other things. I was talking yesterday with a person doing drug development, and he was talking about how much people hate injections. It's like, okay, yes, that's totally true, except when you're talking about certain vaccines or going to the dermatologist and wanting injections put in your face or this, that, and the other. It's like sometimes people really want something and sometimes they don't. And the more we can understand kind of that and what goes into wanting this EVP or maybe not caring a lot about this EVP, that can be really critical. I think that's a construct we sometimes don't pay enough attention to. But I'm a little bit of a broken record on that one, so I'll stop.
No, that's a great one. We definitely want to keep that in mind. Okay, so formulating the guide, let's get to it. We have made this point. We will probably make it more times, but we always want to be really clear on our core project aims or goals, because that is going to shape your data collection approach and your analytic approach. And then drilling down from there, we want to think about the overall goal of the semi-structured interview. As we mentioned before, the goals might be different at different time points, and the goals might be different for different roles. So for example, sometimes in studies, we might have interview guides for high-level leaders. And they're not going to be the people on the ground who are doing implementation. They're going to be the people who maybe have endorsed it, maybe the people who plan to use the results in policy or practice changes. So they're not going to be the ones who you would necessarily get into the weeds with, but they are going to have perspectives that could be really valuable for you in terms of maybe having a vision for the organization, having a strategic plan, and understanding where your project goals fit into that strategic plan. So you may have different goals for different roles, which means that you may need different guides or a guide that allows you to branch for different roles. As much as possible, we would recommend keeping similar types of questions across roles, because that will just enhance your ability to analyze across roles, but there might be some questions that only get asked of people in certain roles. And also thinking about time points, as we were saying before, if you're collecting data mid-implementation, your goal for that might be different than it was at pre or post or any other time point. So we really want to just make sure that the questions that we have incorporated into each guide are clearly tied to our project goals. To just carry through that point a little bit more about who you're talking to, who are your participants. This also has a lot of implications for your interview guides. Our focus today is not really on sampling, but it would be hard for us to talk about interviewing people without thinking about who those people are. We often think about people to interview in terms of those who have something at stake in the process or problem. They might be involved, they might be impacted by it. And there are people who provide support. So we want to talk to the people who have something to do with what we are trying to do in implementation. These are just some examples of the folks who we talk to and include in our studies, certainly not exhaustive. But we want to reflect as we're designing the guide on what do we know about these folks? What knowledge and information are we going in with? In terms of who they are, what their roles are, what the setting and structure of this context looks like. You may not know a lot, and that's okay, but just giving yourself the chance and the team the chance to think about what do we know about folks, what might our assumptions be as we go into this, and also think about who are you in relation to your participants. As you heard, Erin and I are both anthropologists. We are trained in reflexivity is like number one in our field of really thinking about our own roles, backgrounds, types of expertise, et cetera, in relation to our participants, and also think about status. It is part of this process. Knowledge and power and status are part of our implementation processes. And we might want to spend a little bit of time as we're devising guides thinking about the ways that our knowledge of the participants might inform our overall approach. So for example, it might be a matter of having, if you're interviewing a very high level administrator, you might need to put your most senior interviewer on the task of interviewing that person. There's something about the status of, we're going to have our senior interviewer interview you, or we're having our PI interview you if they're well trained in that. Sometimes that's going to matter for the status of the participants. Not always, but it can be important to consider who you're talking to and who is collecting that data and what is their role and identity in relation to those participants. Any other points you want to pick up on there, Erin?
No, I think this is such an important area, and I'm thinking about Tanya Olmos Ochoa's work, kind of increasingly developing some of this piece around peer interviewers and the possibilities there. And I think this whole issue of how power fits in and how do we work with that with wisdom and appropriateness is something we're learning a lot about, and that's really exciting.
Definitely. Okay, so in terms of the elements to formulating your guide, we want to think of, broadly speaking, about what we're trying to achieve in these interviews. We want the interviews to be comfortable. We want them to be friendly. We want them to be inviting and engaging. And we want people to feel safe to tell us what they really think. Can we guarantee that they will? Nope, we can't, but we can do our best. And not only in terms of the questions that we ask, but how we ask them and what we're bringing of ourselves into these data collection encounters. We really want to encourage people to share their truths with us, to share their perspectives with us. And, there's a whole other training we can do on actually conducting interviews. But even in how we formulate the questions, we want to ask them in a way that people feel like they are, they have the opportunity to share different perspectives and that they're open enough that anything is possible in their response. We want to have an explicit purpose identified for the team. So your interviewing team absolutely needs to know why they're doing what they're doing. They need to understand why and how the interview guide meets project goals, what they are being expected to do. And we also need our participants to understand why they're there. Some of that work is going to happen in the recruitment phase, just in terms of how do you even invite people to participate in an interview? What are you explaining to them? What do they think going in? Maybe you've provided a frequently asked question document that gets into some of the different details of the overall project. But everyone involved in this needs to know why they're involved in it. And that will come in a couple of different areas. In terms of your questions, and this, I want to give Ray Maeda, my colleague at Research Talk, a lot of credit for helping us to formulate these criteria. And there aren't a whole lot of things that Erin and I would be dogmatic about, I would say, but these are pretty dogmatic about, which is that your interview guide questions need to be three things. They need to be inviting and accessible and analyzable, and the fourth geared toward the time that you have available. But just dealing with the first three for a moment, we want our questions to hit all of these because, first of all, the questions need to be interesting and they need to be understood. That's an accessibility piece. So we want to be asking people things about things that make sense to them to be asked about, and not asking the questions in opaque or very multivalent ways where we're not, what we're trying to avoid is someone saying, wait, what are you asking? Or what do you want me to answer first? Or I don't understand the question. We're trying to avoid all of those responses to our questions and ask questions in a very clear and accessible format. And we want to make sure that the questions that we include in that guide are going to be useful for meeting our project goals. So a question could be very inviting, but if it's not analyzable, why is it in the guide? It could be very familiar and a nice question and, pretty clear, but if it's not going to meet our goals, it's taking up time that we don't have. We rarely have the time we want to do all these interviews. And so we have to kind of hone in on what's important. And so we really encourage you to think about each question and whether it hits these points and do you have a setup for your interview guide that is going to be feasible to do within the time that you have? So we'll talk a lot about prioritizing questions, thinking about the time that you are supposed to have available, and then what happens when that time actually isn't available. You've scheduled 45 minutes and someone says, you know what, I've got 15 for you now. So, you want to take those 15 minutes, and are you clear, and is the team clear on what you're going to do in those 15 minutes, in that half an hour less than what you expected to be able to have? Any more thoughts there on those, Erin?
Just kind of quickly, I grew up with a lot of non-academics, and there was a real sort of view that if you can't explain something simply, you probably don't understand it that well. And I think there's some wisdom in that for this sort of thing, because I think often when we're approaching a new area, we start out with very complex questions. But having to go through the process of thinking about, okay, what are the pieces? What are we asking about here? And breaking that down in ways that is going to be accessible for everybody we're talking with, who may come from many different environments, is a good discipline for us in clarifying our goals, as well as improving the quality of our communication and the data we walk away with. So I think this is not only a set of criteria, I think it's actually a real push for us to understand our own work better. So I appreciate these characteristics very much.
And we use them all the time. As we're making decisions, it's not as if to say, oh, when you're in the early stage of designing a guide, you have to remember these, but then you get super used to it and you never look again. We use them all the time. We look at questions trying to decide, do we include it? And someone will say, well, but how's that going to help us? Of all the questions we could ask, how's that question going to help us? Is it going to be analyzable? Is it going to be useful for our project goals? So we come back to this rubric all the time in our studies. Now, in terms of interview guide format and layout and volume, what we recommend, and this is held up in many other approaches to designing guides, semi-structured interview guides, is really thinking about the time you have available and the key topics of inquiry. If you think about your guide in terms of what topics do you want to cover well and thoroughly in 45 minutes or in an hour or in a half an hour, you really can't have that many questions. You can't expect that you're going to ask 75 questions in 45 minutes. Or if you plan on doing that, you're probably going to get very, very short answers, which is not really what we're trying to get in qualitative interviews. We want depth, and we want a breadth of information across our key topics. And when we think about the time we have, we probably can't cover well more than about 6 to 8 primary questions. And in focus group interviews, even less, because those questions are really meant to prompt discussion. And so how many discussions can you really have within an hour? Or can you really cover 20 topics? Do you want to cover 20 topics? And why would you want to cover 20 topics? We want to cover the key topics of inquiry, which in our experience can typically be boiled down to about 6 to 8 primary questions in individual interviews. That doesn't mean that there aren't follow-ups, probes, etc. But when we think about topics, it can be really helpful to line up your key topics and think about those as sort of the building blocks of the interview guide. And we want to also think about the order and flow of those questions. What are we asking people, and why are we asking them? Why are we asking them in a particular way? And when and how are we going to probe for more information? And needless to say, the team who is doing the interviews needs to have a very thorough understanding of all of these issues. We have this point about testing your questions, I think, on like 5 or 6 slides. So we are definitely overdoing it, but we cannot stress enough how important it is to test your questions, no matter how experienced you are, no matter how many studies you've done, no matter how many interviews you've done. Every guide is different, and typically every team is different, and you really need to take that time to test your questions before you go into the field. When we think about the opening question, it is pretty central to the dynamic of the interview. We want to open our conversation with a person in an appropriate way and in a comfortable way to put our participant at ease and let them know, hey, we're gonna have a really interesting discussion right now. Some of you might be familiar with James Bradley's work, an anthropologist from many, many years ago who developed this idea of a grand tour question, which is a great way to start interviews, where you're trying to get sort of a verbal tour of something that the person who you're interviewing should know well by virtue of why you included them in the sample, why you recruited them to participate. It can be focused, but it's still sort of opening up a landscape for you. And that can be a very comfortable and inviting way to get started. Excuse me. You might start by asking about background characteristics. Sometimes, for example, we'll start by just having people briefly describe their role. Because even though we have recruited them based on things that we know, going back to that thing about existing knowledge, they might be in a different role by the time they talk to you, or they might have 5 other roles that you didn't know about. Certainly in the VA, we see that all the time, where we think a person has one role and then they're like, yes, that's my primary role, but I also have these other 5 roles. And that can be really helpful for you as an interviewer to know kind of the different areas that they touch and what expertise they may have. We don't typically spend a whole lot of time there, but it is a nice way to get started, open up the conversation just by making sure you know what this person does and who they are. We sometimes would organize a guide starting with some more general questions and then get into more specific questions. There are different approaches to this, but we tend to start a little bit more broadly and then kind of work our way into the details of what we want to know. Erin, anything you want to add there?
No, the only thing I would add is just it's so nice when we're able to signal for folks how deep we want them to go on a particular topic, particularly in these, because there's nothing worse than if you ask a question that's overly broad and then they start to tell you and then you cut them off because you're trying to get to the rest of the guide. And then they're like, oh, because we didn't tell them how much we wanted. So if we want sort of a brief description of XYZ, or trying to make it just being really clear to signal what we want, because so often our participants are trying to meet us where we are as much as we're trying to meet them wherever they are. So just being
such a great point. Yeah, you don't want to find yourself halfway through the interview and the person's still talking about their role and background. So you want those sort of markers in your own application of the guide to know, okay, by this point, I should be about halfway through. This might be something you're keeping to yourself. There might be points at which you share with your participant, we're halfway through, or we have 2 more questions left, or I might speed up a little bit because I still have 3 questions to ask you, that type of thing. And we'll get to that point in just a little bit. So we typically want primary questions that are tied to the main topic and tied to our theory, model, or framework. As I mentioned, we want, a handful of topics that are addressing our project goals, and then we might have prompts and probes under those primary questions. So you may have a guide that looks like 6 or 8 questions, but within each question you have some probes and some prompts. And it's going to be very important to specify which are essential probes and which are optional probes, so that your consistency of data collection across the team is maintained, because everyone knows I need to ask 2B, but I don't necessarily need to ask 2E, but if it comes up, that might be nice. So everyone needs to know where to go for the essential versus the optional probes. And, again, these are semi-structured interview guides that we're talking about. So that means that if it makes sense during the flow of the interview to ask question 4 after question 2, you can do that, because that's the nature of a semi-structured interview encounter, is that I'm going to flow to a question that comes later because of what someone talked about. That takes some practice, but we don't want to be robotic in our use of interview guides. Now I will ask you question number 3. Now I'll ask you question number 4. That's not very fun, not very interesting. It's not going to feel that comfortable. And so you want to be able to flow and be familiar enough with your guide that you can do that. And we want to keep the interview guide succinct so that we really can traverse across these questions in a pretty fluid way. And again, practice saying your questions out loud. And we want to encourage people to give us detail and nuance by saying things like, can you tell me more about that? Can you give me a little bit more detail about that? Can you give me an example? So we want to open up that space for additional information and detail, which is really the beauty of qualitative work, is that we're getting from people's vantage points the detail and nuance that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. So some typical types of questions that we use in interview guides are structural questions. This is again pretty geared toward health services research, but I know some of you are probably doing other types of implementation research. So, shift this into the language and framework that you use in your own work. But it can be really helpful, especially at baseline, to understand what structures are here, how is care delivered, what types of services are available to a given population. You might include some prioritizing questions. One that we really like across interview guides is something along the lines of, what are the top 3 needs of this particular population and why? What I like that question because it will tell me how close those top needs are to the needs that my project is addressing. So if I'm, trying to do something related to one set of needs and people are saying, but the top needs are these other things, I know I'm going to have a lot of work to do to get them from those needs to the needs that we think need to be addressed in the project. And the paper cited below that I wrote several years ago in health services research really uses that responses to that question pretty extensively. You might ask a prioritizing question, like relative to other priorities, how important is this thing that we're introducing? We often ask comparison questions that get at the construct of relative advantage, which can be found in many models and frameworks, like how does this compare to what you are already doing? That's going to be really important for us to know. And hypothetical questions can be really helpful. I would not suggest including a lot of them because they are hypothetical. They're not really giving you that grounded information on what's actually happening. But we often like to end interviews with sort of a, dream for a day, your royalty for a day. You can do whatever you want for a given condition or population. What would you do? That's a really nice way to close an interview because it allows people to dream a little bit. And it's very analyzable. So the other citation you see there by our colleague Julian Bruner, he took the responses to that one question and ended up being able to write a whole paper about it. So that's another thing to think about. Not that our papers are our end goal for all of this necessarily, but sometimes when we're thinking about what questions to include and that analyzability, it could be that you have a body of information and data just from one question that ends up giving you lots of traction for different types of products. Erin, do you want to walk us through the longitudinal interviewing issue?
For sure. And just quickly about that last question, you were just suggesting that the hypothetical or the royalty for a day, or I know you've also described it sometimes as the magic wand question. Another great thing about that is if you're doing it at the end of the interview, this person has just had half an hour or however long to really talk through some of the challenges, the goals, the things they care about. And then you're giving them this opportunity to be creative about what could be better, what could we do? And it's just, there's something kind of wonderful about that, that can be also just a really satisfying way to end an interview. So that was new to me in working with Alison, and I have found it to be so valuable for many, many reasons. Okay, so thinking about longitudinal interviewing, so one of the challenges is, and again, this is coming back to tables and really thinking about how do we map the pieces of the work together and make sure everything is accomplishing what it needs to accomplish. So when we're thinking about longitudinal interviewing, maybe we're interviewing someone at baseline, and then we're talking to them again a year later. Now, in a perfect world, maybe we would all remember exactly what was said a year ago, but that's rarely the case, either for the participant or the interviewer. So we really need to be thoughtful about making sure that our questions are getting us back to our goals from those appropriate time points. So here's just an example from the critical time intervention study that the Housing Transitions Query is working on now. So we have one domain on our interview guide that's around training in CTI, or critical time intervention, as our so training is the implementation strategy. So at baseline, we were asking things like, what were your general expectations for the CTI training? Are you going to be able to go? How's it going? How much have you been able to attend? Do you like it? Are there gaps? Are there improvements? And that was really appropriate to our baseline before we started much more of the implementation. Now we're going back for the 12 months and we're starting to think, okay, so the follow-up question becomes something like, it's been a while now since we did that initial training. Were you able to attend that? And if so, after you did that, how ready did you feel to use the CTI model in your case management? So now we're looking back on this from the perspective of a year later and inviting them to reflect on, okay, what about that was sort of helpful in preparing you, and what wasn't helpful in preparing you for what you were then going to go do later. We also have learned, and when we're doing these longitudinal interviews, we're often going to be talking with folks who weren't necessarily in the role that they're in now 12 months ago. So being able to be thoughtful about, okay, is staff turnover a real issue at the site you're working with? Is that relevant to your topic? Do you need to frame questions that are going to also be useful, available, appropriate to your project goals for folks who weren't there? And in this case, it's very much the case. So we can ask about, if you weren't there for the training that we did, have you received any training in the interim and maybe some other venue that we should know about? And how well did that work? Did it give you what you needed? So just thinking about how the perspective on the problem is likely to shift from baseline to 12-month, and being thoughtful about making sure that you're getting data that really maps to each other. So these are questions that map back to the concept of training and perspectives on the training, but are appropriate to their different time points. So they're different, but they talk to each other, and you'll be able to integrate those data later.
And tables, again, will be super helpful with this. Tables. So when you're going to formulate your post-implementation interview guide, incorporate it into the table that you used for your pre-implementation guide. So you can see which questions are we asking over time, which ones do we not need to ask again. That's going to be really helpful for analysis, because you'll be able to see at a glance, we have 3 time points of data on this construct. We have 2 points of data on this one, and that's going to be really handy and helpful for your consistency and your analytic options down the road. So I'd say we could talk for like hours more. We're going to breeze through so that we can get to at least some of your questions, and maybe we'll even do a part 2, because there's so much good stuff to talk about and we haven't gotten into your questions yet, but we'll keep going for just a little bit, and then we'll get as far as we can and we'll turn to your questions for the remaining 15 minutes or so. It would be my guess. So sensitive questions, I don't think we're going to get into this too much right now. We really want, if we're asking sensitive questions, and this can be across the board in terms of your sample, it's not limited to patients, clients, etc. There could be some sensitive questions that you're asking of other folks in your sample. Of course, you don't want to start with, kind of in your face sensitive questions right at the beginning of an interview. You want to establish rapport, make sure that they feel comfortable, make sure you feel comfortable, and give people a chance to, kind of warm up to the interview encounter, and then maybe move into some sensitive questions. You want to be sure that you're asking these questions in ways that are appropriate and relevant, especially in cross-cultural contexts, and status differential contexts, thinking about who you're asking what and in what ways. We can certainly come back to this, but it is something, worth attention if you're incorporating some more sensitive questions into your guide. And then finally, closing the interview, we really want to try, when we're designing our closing questions, to come to a very peaceful and affirmative conclusion to the data collection episode. Spradley talks about this as taking leave, which I love. This idea that we all want to leave the interview context feeling good, feeling satisfied, feeling like we learned something, we had a meaningful exchange. So we often say, ask at the end, in addition to that magic wand question, we might ask something like, is there anything I haven't covered that you thought we would discuss? That's been really fruitful for us because people build expectations for what they think that you're going to talk about. And sometimes people will say, oh yeah, I thought you were going to ask me about this. And that might be something that is worth pursuing. So I've really loved how that question has panned out. Another typical closing question is there anything else you'd like to add? I prefer the previous one a little bit more because I've just gotten more interesting information, whereas with the second one, people are usually like, nope, that's it, we covered it. But sometimes it's not a bad question, it just hasn't been as fruitful in my experience. And of course, you want to express your appreciation for the time that people have given to you. And what we've learned so much, even in our current implementation studies, is the extent to which our interviewers are really seen as ambassadors for the project and are often asked questions themselves. And it's very, very important that everyone on the team understands kind of the image of the project that you're projecting through the delivery of this interview guide. So just in terms of designing your guides, I think we've made the point sufficiently that tables can be really helpful, thinking about the constructs that you're covering and what questions do you need to cover each construct. You'll see this in our examples in just a minute or two. We want to make sure that questions are clearly prioritized and highlighted because you want to make sure that data collection is consistent and the team needs to know which questions to go to if time is cut short. We like labeling questions with constructs because it just helps us again map back to the theory model framework that we selected. Obviously, you're not going to read those when you're doing the interview, but it's very nice to keep the interviewers and the overall team oriented toward the intent of each question and make sure to test your questions and do different types of pilot testing and budget time for this part of the process. Again, no matter how experienced you are, you have to engage in some pilot testing. Could be internal, could be some experts coming in and taking a look, could be that you do some field testing, could do all three. That's great, but you have to do something to make sure that the guide actually makes sense and that the people who are going to be using it feel comfortable with it. So let's just show you a couple of examples and then we'll wrap up with our talking portion and get to your questions and comments. So this is an example. I took out details specific to the project, but this is an example using REAIM. If you haven't seen Jody Haltrop's paper about qualitative approaches to using REAIM, I definitely recommend checking it out because it's a way of thinking beyond what we might think of in terms of reach. For example, we might think, well, that's typically quantitative. You know, did we reach the number of people who we were intending to reach? But there are really great qualitative questions that we can ask in relation to reach too. So what you see here are some questions that help us get at reach using the lovely explanations that Jody and colleagues provide in that paper for different members of the sample, patients, stakeholders, although I acknowledge we are moving away from that terminology, leaders. And similarly, we can see some questions about adoption, some questions about maintenance. So this is just reflecting that mapping to the construct in the framework and how we might design questions for different people in the sample, different groups of people in the sample. Another example is from a study that I conducted with Donna Washington several years ago, where we wanted to get at people's perceptions of a tool that we were designing to assess vulnerability to homelessness. And we used CFIR 1.0 for the guide. And you can see here that we pulled on the intervention characteristics domain of CFIR. Our constructs are on the left, and how we operationalize those constructs in the form of the interview guide questions are in the column on the right. You can see that there are, some components of the questions multiple pieces addressing complexity, design, quality, packaging. So some constructs you're going to need to get at with more than one question, and other constructs you might be able to get at with one question, like relative advantage. But the one point that I would just make here is that not without exception, but for the most part, the constructs themselves are going to be more academic, maybe a little bit more distal to what people's actual ways of talking about things are. So we don't tend to use the language of the construct in the actual question. So we're getting at the concept behind the construct, but we're not going to say, what is the relative advantage of this, intervention? Because people aren't necessarily going to know what that means. So we want to get at the construct, but using words, terminology that people will actually understand. And then, Erin, do you want to walk us through the empower one real quick?
Well, we did. I think I just wanted to provide a counterpoint to all the tables. So I think I didn't want to leave you with the impression that we don't necessarily end up with tables as an interview guide.
Great point.
Do that. Some folks really love that. They find it really clean. That doesn't tend to be what we do. We tend to actually use that as a starting place and then move towards a document that really walks interviewers, particularly because we're usually working with teams of interviewers and we want to make sure everybody's on the same page through the whole process. So we end up with a document that sort of walks folks through the interview encounter in what is intended to be a supportive way. So this is just an example of the first page of our current Empower 2.0 pre-implementation interview guide. And you see that, one of our first questions that we had to sort through as a team was sort of, who are we talking to, given that if we're talking to 19 different sites about 3 different possible evidence-based practices, we are not talking to one group of people. We are talking to a lot of different people. So we need to be able to be attuned to kind of who are the different people we're likely to be talking to. So we have that there so when folks sit down with this guide before the interview, they can go, okay, that's right. This is who I'm talking to. This is why I'm talking to these folks. And we're all on the same page. And then we have a script that we offer folks to walk through. I don't think there's any expectation that we're going to walk through that word for word, but it's there to support people in this interview encounter. It also is there to provide some continuity and some consistency across interviewing, because that's going to support conducting the interviews in a consistent way. So we do tend to make the final interview guide a pretty formal document, but again, that's just intended to support that kind of consistency. And if we go to the next slide, unless there's more you wanted to say about this.
No, go ahead.
This just shows sort of how we tend to set up the primary questions and then the prompts. And you see, we talk a lot about prioritizing questions because that does end up being so important. So you can see we have a little key up in the corner where blue questions are maybe specific to a particular participant role, and then the gray questions are our high priority questions. So these are the kind of come hell or high water, these are the questions we want to make sure we get answered in this interview. And we lay them out. We often have headers, again, just helping folks to always know without having to think about it very much, what's the point of this question? Why are we asking this? What matters most? So that interviewers don't have to reach back into their memory during the course of the interview. They have all the information they need right there to support them. What else would you say about that?
Oh gosh, so much. I will try to restrain myself. I think, okay, two points that I want to make. One is how important it is to have your interviewing team involved in constructing the guide. I think that we, in designing this guide, there were many people involved at every level of the project: PIs, interviewing team, people with a lot of experience, people with less experience, but a lot of knowledge. And you need to give yourself time, and you need to make sure that the people who are going to be doing the interviews are really comfortable with the setup. And I think it took us a little time to get to this point of saying, let's highlight the questions that are the most priority. And so you may make a different choice on your team, and that's fine, but this is the kind of thing that you need to think through as a team. And the second point that I would make is that this approach to prioritizing the questions and having them indicated, using highlights and so forth, was extremely helpful for our rapid analysis. So another thing that we often think of as we're designing guides is, how are we going to move this into analysis, especially if that analysis needs to take place quickly. And so there's much more to say about that, but that's something to just bear in mind as you're working through the guide, is what are your intentions analytically, and are there ways that you can make life a little easier by setting it up to facilitate later analysis. So much more to say, but those would be the two really quick points. Okay, so just a couple more things and then we will stop talking and hear what you all are thinking. It can be very helpful to build transitional statements into the guide. That might be something like, I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to ask you a different type of question now. If you're a very experienced interviewer, you're probably going to do those things, very intuitively. But I think especially as you're getting going with new project, new people on the team, sometimes people prefer to have that transitional language built in. And you want, during the course of doing the interview, to keep, as Erin was saying earlier, to keep your participants aware of where you're at in the interviewing process. And don't forget, even though we're not focused on doing interviews today, but don't forget that silence is okay. It can be useful. And so it is okay to ask your question and just wait for them to answer. If they pause and you're feeling like, oh my gosh, they don't understand the question, I've got to reframe it 10 times. Probably not. They probably just need a minute to take it in. So get used to that idea of asking what is hopefully a very good question, and give people a chance to think and formulate their response. You don't need to just immediately jump in and say the question in 4 new ways because you assume that if they didn't answer right away, they didn't understand it. It's usually not the case. Making adjustments to guides. This is a very critical thing to think about. If you're making a big adjustment to a guide, that has a lot of implications. That means you're adding a whole new topic of inquiry. So that is not a light thing to do. It's not a small thing to do. It's actually a very important thing to do. It might have IRB implications. If you're just changing the wording on the fly, that's going to be very characteristic of semi-structured interviews. You still want to bring your style and flavor to it. You don't want to change it so much that it becomes a different question. So we really want to stick to the essence of the question, even if we're saying it in slightly different ways. If you are making adjustments, those need to be extremely well documented and communicated. And I would recommend keeping all the versions of a guide so that you can see how it evolved. So there are those adjustments that you make to the written guide. There are also adjustments that you make sort of on the fly as you're using the guide. And this really comes back to what we were saying before about prompts and probes, and being really clear about which prompts are essential and critical and which ones are more informal or non-essential. You want to make sure that you are tracking the evolution of your guide, debriefing, and documenting any points about how the interview flowed, any surprises, any missteps. If things are really changing, you're probably going to need to go back to the IRB, depending on your institutional regulations. And you really want to give time to the team to discuss the evolution of the guide and periodically assess whether the interview is still mapping to your project goals or if you need to make some changes. We don't have much left, so I'm going to breeze through, Erin, and then if there's anything else, actually we only have one more left, then just resources. Lots of challenges that we could talk about, and they may be in some of your questions as well. I would say in large projects with large teams, you really want to make sure to build in the time for the team to talk about how the interviews are going. Make sure that everyone is still clear on how the different questions are connecting to the project goals. And as we were talking about before, that co-development process is critical, checking in is critical, and you can use your analytic tools to help identify whether there are gaps in data collection, which could be addressed. So I feel like we could talk so much more, but let's turn to your questions just to orient you to what else we have here. There are some additional readings that were referenced throughout. This is the link to our playlist where this workshop and other workshops and beachside chats are located from our hub. We want to acknowledge many sources of funding for which we are very grateful, and we are very grateful to all of you. So thank you so much for listening, and let's take our remaining moments to get through some of your questions, which I know Elena, I believe, has been curating for us. So I probably shouldn't look at the chat because I'll want to answer everything. So Elena or Erin, you may have been keeping an eye on the chat as well. Are there no. Okay, Elena, do you want to draw our attention to a couple of questions that we can address in the time we have remaining?
Sure, absolutely. So one question we received was if the interviews will be conducted virtually or in a hybrid approach. So, thinking half are in person and half are virtual, what adjustments to the interview guide should be considered?
Really good question. I think, and this is very off the cuff, I'm curious what you think too, Erin. I think for me, there wouldn't necessarily be a lot of differences in the questions. There might be differences in how we deliver, execute the guide, deliver the questions, because there's just the potential for being more personable when you're in a room with someone. So you have more techniques available to you in terms of body language, eye contact, etc. That just make for a different interviewing experience. Although I think we can do very good interviews virtually. So I couldn't possibly be opposed to that because that is what we've been doing for so many years now. But I'm not sure that I would actually make changes to the questions as much as just be very aware of the timing, because we tend not to, I think virtually we tend not to build in as much of the sort of ebb and flow of conversation as we would in person. So you might need to be a little bit more tuned into the time that you have and kind of how you're setting up this virtual interviewing encounter. But I'm probably forgetting things that would be important to bring up with that question. Very good question. Erin, what are your thoughts?
No, I actually agree. I don't know that I would necessarily do anything differently in the script, although I'm sure that's actually a fascinating conversation to have because there probably are good things. But what comes to mind is mostly just I would want to make sure that the team was debriefing so that the folks who are doing the in-person interviews probably have some information about what isn't quite as smooth as we want it to be that folks doing virtual interviews might not have, and just making sure we can share that across the team and really learn from it and adjust if needed. What a great topic. Oh, we have to talk more about that another time.
We do.
Great. We have several other questions, so I know we'll get through as many as we can while we're on the line together, and then follow up as we can on questions that might be relevant to the whole group after the session. So the next question is, how can we increase accessibility for folks with reduced decision-making capacity? So how can we also make questions more inviting when, discussing taboo subjects like illicit substance use, and also kind of working with folks in the context of interviews who have reduced decision-making capacity?
Such a good question. Another great one. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me with that question is the importance of designing the guide with people who have a very deep well of understanding about the population who you are intending to interview. So you really need people who know that population, who know how to frame questions, potentially know questions that might not be very successful interview guide questions, even though you might like it, it might just not be appropriate. And think about the language that you're using for each question, again, to heighten the accessibility of the question for folks who may need a, kind of a shorter question, a more straightforward question, and temper your own expectations of how that interview will go as well. So I would say, for interviewers, that's not a new interviewer, that's probably not the first thing that I'm going to ask them to do, is a very difficult interview with sensitive questions with a population that may need some tailoring of the questions given cognitive capacity and stuff like that. So I would, make sure that the people who are starting off with those interviews are very experienced with that population, and maybe have others on the team observe and learn from, very experienced interviewers. What else, Erin? What are you thinking in relation to that?
No, the only thing I would add would just be making sure it was appropriate to be interviewing these individuals and that they were
Yeah.
supported where they need to be supported. But no, I think there's many kinds of challenges. I think humility and respect are such a core value in the work we do. No, nothing else to add.
Yeah, humility is such a great point. I mean, we as interviewers are there to learn, and adopting that learner posture is really key to effective interviews. We're not going in there saying we know everything and you just happen to be someone I want to talk to. We're going in there saying we want to learn from you, we want to gain from your expertise, and that can be found at many levels. So just going in with that posture is going to really start things off in a strong way.
Great, thank you. We might have time for one, possibly two more questions. So this next question is about kind of determining the number of folks to interview. The participant says, I've used the point of saturation as a factor in determining the number of interviews to collect, but given concerns with feasibility, time to transcribe and code, ensuring there are enough interviews for publication, et cetera, what do the presenters think are important considerations for determining the total number of interviews needed?
Super good topic. We could do a whole workshop on that. I think what we'll do, I'm thinking in general that we'll provide some additional resources to folks. We can provide resources on the topic of saturation, and we can answer questions that have come up that we can't cover in the time that we have. So we'll try to do that and get that out to our to all of you attendees. I would say that there isn't a magic number. There are, many studies that have been done to calculate reasonable sample sizes for achieving saturation, but I say that with some hesitation because there are many different concepts of saturation. What it means to me might be different than what it means to someone else on the call. And so that's one thing to be very mindful of, is whose version and concept of saturation are you linking to? What does it mean for your project? And sometimes it is about sampling, sometimes saturation is more applied to analysis than sampling. So kind of locating where you are in terms of thinking about sampling is going to be a precursor to deciding your numbers. If I had to give a number, and a number that's based on many studies that have looked at sample size and compared sample sizes across studies, we typically are looking for, somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 30 interviews, but that depends on how many variables you have in your sample. So the more comparisons you want to make, the bigger your sample becomes. So there's so much to say about this issue. And it depends on how many people are available to you. Maybe you're in a small clinic doing this work and you want to try to interview all the primary care providers. So that might not be more than 5 people, but it's everyone who's available. So there's a lot of considerations in there, and we'll definitely provide some resources for you to go to that have a lot more to say about this topic. Erin, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's wonderful. I mean, I assume when we send around resources, we'll send around the information power paper, which is also very useful as an alternate way of thinking about saturation and can be very useful in terms of educating reviewers for grants around, so there's multiple ways of looking at this and there's some different options, and we have chosen X option because that is right for this work. So yes, we will say more about that, but it's a great question and it continues to have so much relevance. We have to think about it all the time.
Yep. I think we're at the end of our time. I really want to see the other questions, but we'll take a look. We'll do our best to respond and provide any additional resources we're so excited that there's so much interest in this, and I hope we've moved you along the path of designing guides or thinking about guides that you've been designing. Thank you so much for your feedback and for joining us today. Hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you, Erin, for doing this with me and for the hub, and thank you, Elena, and thanks to everyone for this workshop. We really appreciate this opportunity. Thanks so much, everyone. Take good care. Bye.